So what I'm presenting on today is an article that was recently published in a symposium in the Nationalities papers. And it was published in February 2022, so it just came out. And it's an interesting symposium because it was launched by Florian Bieber, who is a very well-known scholar of nationalism. And he wrote this highly influential paper entitled Global Nationalism in Times of COVID Pandemic. And his question that he started out with is, what is the pandemic going to do to the overall level of nationalism that we see around the world, right? So there's been a lot of concern that, we see all this populism, nationalism in leaders' speeches, and then this growth of movements, particularly on the right in the last 10 years. And so the pandemic was thought to be something that might push us in one direction or another, kind of on the global level, but certainly in some discrete society. So there was this debate about this. And he argued that the pandemic, that basically nationalism is, kind of better thought of as a trajectory. So there's a sort of an aggregate level of nationalism, let's say within a society, and a certain shock happens. So this could be an exogenous shock, the pandemic, and it could lead us in one direction or another. And he said basically we should expect more or less the same level of nationalism after the pandemic as before the pandemic. Because of the stickiness of these pathways. Political scientists talk about path dependency a lot. And so he wrote this in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic, and I was the very last person to respond in this symposium. It just took me a long time because I was doing analysis of political artwork, so I needed permissions to publish. And so the whole thing wrapped up literally 2 years after the beginning of the pandemic. So you can kind of see the different contributions, come out during the different waves and how that might have had an impact. So let me just give you a little snippet of what I was thinking about and what I was observing at the time. So these are two statements by the Prime Minister of Denmark, and then of course the former President Donald Trump in the US. And Fredrickson says at the beginning, and so these are basically the same week almost, we must stand together. We have to take care of each other, but in a different way than we usually do. As Danes, we usually seek the community by being close together. Now we must stand together by standing apart. And then we have a very different tone chosen by President Donald Trump, who says, I always treated the Chinese virus very seriously and have done a very good job from the beginning, including my very early decision to close the borders from China against the wishes of almost all. Right. So the question that I started with is how do we get these such different responses by state leaders, and what, if anything, does that mean for nationalism? So I began with this discussion of how nationalism impacts pandemics, and this is also covered by other contributors to the symposium who looked at past pandemics and what might be interpreted as nationalism today. So as you all know, under the Westphalian state system, each state is presumed to enjoy a monopoly of legitimate authority over the territory and people within its borders. This nice Weberian definition. So this might be broadly thought of as, at least in the age of nationalism, the ethnos. So with the decline of religious authority as a source of sovereign power and also theocracy, basically the nation or the ethnos is thought to be the main source of legitimating authority for states to exercise this control over the territory within its borders. And so, as a number of very well-known scholars have pointed out, Ernest Gellner, Maleshevich, also Anderson, pretty much Hobsbawm, Nairn, all of them have argued that the modern state derives its authority from nationalism. And this is an important point by Giddens, the state is a preeminent form of the power container of the nation. So basically the state serves the nation in a very important way. And the state leader is delegated to basically protect the nation, which implies protecting all the people and all the organizations and everything within the borders of the juridical state. So what does this mean for a pandemic? So nationalism says that during periods of shock and crisis, the state must respond first to the needs of the core ethno-national community. And in this pandemic, like other pandemics in the past, state leaders were evaluated on the basis of how well they protected the nation. So you may remember all of these, COVID databases that allow you to look at the extent to which state governments were succeeding and pulling down the curve, right? And we were comparing them against each other. So basically what we're doing is engaging in a kind of evaluation of success theater, which basically means that we're looking at the ways in which, or the extent to which, state leaders are effectively protecting their nation as it's conceived. So what about populism? And this is kind of where I'm bringing in a little bit of my more recent work. So modern political regimes, really from all types of regimes, derive their legitimacy from the will of the people. So this is the principle of popular sovereignty that emerged from the French and American revolutions. Individuals in modern democracies in particular expect that their governments will respond to the expressed preferences of ordinary people. And then the question comes, what constitutes ordinary people? And this is where the politics come into play. During crises of representation, okay, populist demands arise for political closure around a core political group, right? And this is the idealized demos. So now we have both the ethnos and the demos. Populism thrives in pandemics because the threat is hard to grasp. It's hard to understand how this virus can be so invisible, but also so deadly. And to the extent that health crises are handled by scientific or policy elites who make life-altering decisions, and this may go against the will of the people, this might give rise to populist demands. This means that there is this wide popular perception that the people's will is frustrated, which can lead to populist social mobilization. And we can see this with the vaccine refusals, the anti-vax protests, the anti-lockdown protests, and the like. So this is kind of how I'm thinking about this. And this is a figure that I created for a 2018 article published in Ethnopolitics. And here I'm drawing on a number of people, including Rogers Brubaker, Benjamin DeClean, Jenne Stavrakakis, all of whom, Ben Moffitt, all of whom conceptualize nationalism and populism as defining orthogonal categories in what I call a kind of sovereign space. So here, basically, a populist sort of populism stands against liberalism in the sense that liberalism says, we should accept plurality of people and ideas and interests, and we should basically sort of, argue it out and debate it out and try to come to a compromise solution. And they're very open to elite or technocratic rule. They're very open to the international system. So I think of liberalism as defining a very tall sovereignty, which is connected to the international system and is okay with elites basically making these decisions on behalf of the people, whereas a populist kind of sovereign imaginary would say that the government really should be closer to the people. It should be, these elites are not representing us. Instead, they're frustrating our will, and therefore they should be excluded from this idealized sovereignty. And on the other hand, this is the ethnos, which could be conceived as very broad, including, and I've included here dashed lines, it could be even a porous border that could include migrants, even that there might be some porousness from outside communities, or it could be inscribed as very, very narrow, right? So including only the ethno-national majority. And then it could be bigger, it could include minorities. So these are basically different differently exclusionary conceptions of the ethnos. And Andreas Wimmer has essentially the bottom part of this in an article he published about 20 years ago. Okay, so how to think about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is where in the article I talk about how you can have in the same society different sovereign imaginaries, right? That are basically used to mobilize different communities within maybe the same sort of society. So this is calling for a conceptualization of nationalism in a way that is much more rhetorical, that is used as a kind of a tool for projecting the idealized community onto the public sphere, the public imagination, right? And so a liberal nationalism would be bigger, basically. It would imagine a kind of a taller sovereignty, something that's okay with some type of elite rule or technocratic rule. And it might also be broader. It might be more inclusionary of minorities, for example, or even immigrants. And then ethnopopulism basically says we need the ethnos narrower. We need to include or privilege the rights or the interests of the core ethno-national group. And we're having a problem with these elites, right, which can be defined in a number of different ways. Okay, so just to talk about this a little bit more in depth, so you have this liberal nationalism where basically ethnos and demos are configured broadly. Nationalism is important because it provides a necessary glue for liberalism to function, because no individual can be context free, but all can be free within a context. This comes from Yael Tamir, a famous proponent of liberal nationalism. But it's a bordered community, which basically says that when you do have threats from the outside, because there is always an other, when there's a national self, there's always a national other. But so during these times, we have to basically tighten the borders. We have to create restrictions, and so you saw this with border nationalism everywhere, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. Didn't matter which country or who was in power; they were all basically like shutting borders. But then during those non-crisis periods, they have a tendency to be more open. And they're always going to retain this kind of connection with the international organizations and promote international cooperation. So ethnopopulism, by contrast, is exclusionary, as I said before. The demos is also exclusionary to the extent that elites like Fauci or the WHO internationally, this would all be seen as part of a kind of an other, as not belonging to the true sovereign community. Okay, so let me quickly jump because I'm running out of time. So why study leader rhetoric? The argument that I make is that state executives, because they're delegated to provide the support to the core nation, they play a critical role in framing the sovereign imaginary. Okay, and then basically what they do is project this idealized sovereign space in which the community is expected to live, basically, to use as a model to configure their day-to-day social relations. So the research strategy that I use is combining Essex School discourse analysis with an analysis of political artwork in the US to look at what this actually looks like visually and how images are used to basically perform these functions. It's not just words, it's also images. So to do that, I have two posters. One is a political poster by former Governor Andrew Cuomo, former New York governor. And the second is a political cartoon by pro-Trump political cartoonist Ben Garrison, and you can Google him. He's got a lot of interesting other types of work, but it took me a while, as I said, to get permissions to reproduce these images. So the first is from Andrew Cuomo's office. So basically he was using this kind of progressive era, populist era, late 19th century style of poster work to convey in a very easy way, in a very graspable way, how he imagined that New York would respond to the pandemic. And you can see that this is an image of all, a multi-ethnic community, from all different religious backgrounds and ethno-racial origins, and they're all working together to pull down the curve together, right? Love wins. You see this rainbow. You see the sun on the other side. You do see some threats, right? We have to protect against the Europeans that are coming in 3 million strong, and also the winds of fear. And then we have the sea of divisions. So this is something that liberal nationalists are very concerned about. We have to unite. So this is a unifying, integrative type of nationalism that's positive in a lot of important ways. Okay, so contrast that with the Ben Garrison cartoon that I mentioned earlier. So there's a number of similar types of cartoons, but here you can actually see a smaller idealized sovereignty where you have the the US here, and it's being threatened by this hostile foreign power, right? That's bringing the China virus. This hostile power has also, crushed all of these other nations. It's supporting rocket man Kim Jong-un, and it's fighting with India, right? And we can see here, I hope you can see this, when Xi is Winnie the Pooh. You also see Henry Kissinger. I'm happy to answer questions because anyone who knows about Kissinger might be confused about this. But you also see the Clintons and Biden holding a bag of money. And what's really important here is that these are members of the American nation, right, that are now basically inscribed as outside of the nation, and not just outside of the nation, but also working together with the enemies of the nation, right? So this is how elites and foreign nations are seen as similarly hostile to the core ethno-national communities. So this is ethnopopulism, right? And this gives rise to, and it supports conspiracy theories, which I'm also happy to talk about. I think I've run out of time. I do have a couple other cartoons, but I just wanted to say that this is the contribution, as I see it, is that this leads us to think about ways in which nationalism serves as a rhetorical device and also as a tool of imagination that can be used to mobilize politically, and that state executives actually use in order to conduct and support and rationalize their pandemic policies, and that we're basically engaging collectively in an evaluation of their success theater, where they're going forward and trying to show that, oh, we're doing this great job. And you have people like Trump and Bolsonaro and Modi who are using very kind of like hostile rhetoric against China, engaging in all this populist fury, sort of like, but at the same time kind of dismissing it, right? So they have their model of pandemic management. And in the case of the US, maybe possibly Brazil, we'll see, elections are later this year. This was actually instrumental in what some have called regime change in the US, the election of Joe Biden, who came with a very different model that looks a lot more like the Cuomo model of liberal nationalism. And people decided, let's give this a try. So this should lead us to think about nationalism less as sort of like, institutions or kind of organic forms, so as much as rhetorical tools and also political movements. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Erin. I enjoyed it very much. Is there any question online or offline?
Sorry, I went a little long.
Nothing. This is the way.
Do you hold one?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my question would be, just I would say as a clarification, do you think the two types of nationalism narrative that you were mentioning, are they kind of working against each other, or can they work in comparison as well? Or is there something that you can, either you use one or the two, can they be a part of the polarization process as well? Or how would you see that dynamics there?
That's a great question. Yeah, I do think they're competitors, and I do think that if you take a look at all of the, I mean, you can see this everywhere. I think you can, if you look at the rhetoric that is being used by national leaders as opposed to local leaders who come from different parties very often, they are often following divergent models, and they're using their models as a means of politically targeting those proponents of other models, if you see what I mean. So in a way, I think I think of this as competitor or a form of politicking, let's say, in a way, kind of competitor movements. Right, you can have also a kind of a left-wing populism too, which is a kind of a flat but very wide sovereignty, but that didn't really do that well. You know, speaking of success theater, there weren't a whole lot of takers. There weren't a whole lot of leaders who were willing to just keep their borders open, even though the WHO argued that they should. Right, so you have, you have all of these Republican governors in the US who are using a very ethno-populist models that are basically targeting immigrants, suggesting they're bringing COVID into the country, arguing that these, Biden's approach is too soft, right? So you have these that are kind of in dialogue with and in competition with each other. And you can even have another layer, which we've seen, Democratic mayors who are basically using a broader sovereignty to argue we have to care for each other, therefore we need the mask mandates also in the schools. And, this actually entering the legal realm where they've sued each other, basically to follow the prescriptions that follow from their divergent sovereign imaginaries. Sorry, that was a long answer.
Can I ask a follow-up question? Just a quick one about through your research, have you find a difference between, if you take it as a rhetoric tool, is there a difference between using it within their nation as a territory or in their international discourse? Have you seen any type of difference there?
That's a great question. I will have to think about this. I do think that each of these models maps onto a different vision of world order. And I have another publication coming out on that later this year, but basically this idea that, the ethnopopulist world is a lot more kind of like focused on bilateralism, a lot less in favor of, international organizations. They tend to be much more systemic revisionists, both on the left and the right. Right, they're anti-system and they're also anti-international system, and so that would be my sort of quick answer to that. The liberal nationalists are in favor of protecting, they are in favor of borders, but they also are in favor of, this technocratic rule and this approach towards international organizations that would promote cooperation. The idea is that we have to all work together in order to solve this problem. And that's not what ethnopopulists believe.